Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. Today I'm talking about the first film in what's considered the holy trinity of Nicolas Cage movies, and that's the 1996 movie The Rock. In The Rock, Ed Harris plays a rogue US general that, alongside a bunch of Marines, take over Alcatraz, hold a bunch of people hostage, and threaten to unleash a deadly gas on San Francisco if the government don't comply with their demands. So it's up to FBI biochemist Nicolas Cage and former SAS captain and ex-prisoner Sean Connery to break into Alcatraz and save the day. I want you to cast your mind back to 2002, back when the UK government were investigating Iraq and whether or not they were a threat. An MI6 report claiming that they had a source with phenomenal access to Iraq's biological and chemical weapon capabilities claimed that these weapons were stored in containers including linked hollow glass spheres. As was pointed out in the Chilcot report, glass containers were not typically used in chemical munitions, and a popular movie, The Rock, had inaccurately depicted nerve agents being carried in glass beads or spheres. And based on that misinformation, Tony Blair justified military action in Iraq a year later. So in other words, the movie The Rock led to Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. Pretty crazy, huh? I just thought it'd be fun to start off a review with a fun fact like that. Another fun fact is this is the only Nicolas Cage movie I own on DVD. I bought it for like £1 in a charity shop about 10 years ago. It even comes with a little leaflet thing. Oh cool, there's a biography section. Oh, what does it say about Nicolas Cage? He made his feature film debut in Rumblefish and... Wait, what? Nicolas Cage's first movie wasn't Rumblefish. He starred in Valley Girl and that came out like 6 months before Rumblefish. And if we're getting technical, his first feature film debut was actually as an extra in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So I guess I know more than a leaflet. Anyway, let's talk about Michael Bay. I think nowadays when most people think about Michael Bay, they think of the Transformers movies. I mean, they do literally take up a third of his filmography. I don't like those Transformers movies, and I wouldn't particularly call myself a Michael Bay fan. But in preparation for this video, I started watching a lot of Michael Bay analysis videos. I was trying to get an overview of him as a filmmaker. The best one I found was called Michael Bay, Understanding a True American Auteur. It was actually a really interesting video, and it kind of made me respect Michael Bay by the end of it. It's undeniable that the man has a distinct vision and a unique voice that he brings to all of his films. And I respect that. You can often just turn on a Michael Bay movie without knowing who directed it and go, yep, that's Michael Bay. And in that vein, watching that video and thinking back to Michael Bay's movies that I've seen, I thought because The Rock was Michael Bay's second movie he ever did, I thought it might be fun to make a checklist of Michael Bay's trademarks and things that commonly crop up in his movies, and see how many of those things appear in The Rock. Let's start with an obvious one. Explosions and mass destruction. Check. I mean, of course, that one's a no-brainer. Even the Meatloaf music videos Michael Bay directed had explosions. Most of the action in The Rock is really fun. There's some great shootouts and kills. There's a really fun sequence on a cart that's in a track in Alcatraz, and it feels like a video game, but in a fun way. But the most Michael Bay-ish action scene in the movie is this elaborate car chase sequence. I mean, it is very impressive on a technical level. Cars are flipping over and exploding left, right, and center, but I can't help but get a little bored during this part. It goes on for what feels like 10 minutes. And also, it's like, we're 45 minutes into this movie about Alcatraz, and our main characters aren't at Alcatraz yet. Why don't we trim down this action scene and get the plot moving a little bit? Back to the checklist, Michael Bay's themes often include patriotism, check. Although, I mean, I've got an American flag behind me and I'm not even American. A pro-military, anti-government message, tick. Michael Bay's movies often glorify soldiers, and the bureaucrat government people are often criticized. And that's the case here with Ed Harris's character's whole motivation, and the blame placed almost entirely on the government. Although what's interesting here is that technically the military in this movie are the villains, but I would argue that Ed Harris's character isn't necessarily vilified, and I'll talk about that more later. Michael Bay movies often have a very distinct look in terms of cinematography and directorial choices and imagery. You've got quick cuts, shaky cam, and sweeping shots, blue or yellow color scheme, a shot of a sunset, a shot of a jet flying over a guy's head. Wow, check, 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 check. That's 4 in 1. On a less fun note, his depictions of certain people are often a little bit problematic, with stuff like misogyny. I'm not quite gonna give this a check. I mean, there's barely any female characters in this movie, and when there are, they're pretty one-dimensional. You do have this line,
"Losers always whine about their best. Winners go home and fuck the prom queen."
which I guess is pretty sexist, but it's also the coolest line in the movie. And at least there's no gratuitous shots where the camera like ogles the body of the scantily clad women like in most of Michael Bay's movies. Michael Bay is also known for kind of racist and homophobic stereotypes and jokes. This is another one I won't give a full tick to. Michael Bay does often use a loud black guy to punctuate the chaos of a scene, and that happens very briefly in this. But yeah, in terms of racial stuff, it's a lot better than those two things from Transformers.
I'm in the truck and then nobody gonna know nothing, not me.
Now, in terms of gay stereotypes, you have this, like, lisping, effeminate hairdresser guy. This is a very broad, stereotypical depiction of what I can assume is meant to be a gay person.
I don't want to know nothing. I never saw you throw that gentleman off the balcony. All I care about is, are you happy with your haircut?
It really feels like this character is just there to be laughed at. You know, a lot of Michael Bay's worst traits kind of got worse as his filmography went on. But to his credit, his most recent movie, Ambulance, had a gay character that I thought was handled relatively tastefully in terms of Michael Bay. And by the way, in defense of Michael Bay's involvement of some of those stereotypical problematic things I was mentioning, Michael Bay doesn't have a writing credit on any of his movies. But when a pattern like that crops up, you've got to think maybe he does have some sort of involvement with stuff like that. In fact, it is quite interesting to note that people who did write on this movie included Quentin Tarantino and Aaron Sorkin. They don't appear in the credits, and I couldn't find out specifically which lines and what parts of the story they helped to contribute to. My theory is that Aaron Sorkin was involved with a lot of the Ed Harris political stuff. And with Tarantino it's a bit harder, but I have a feeling that he might have contributed to that prom queen line. So let's talk about Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage here is straight off the heels of winning an Oscar. So he decided to follow that up with an over-the-top movie about breaking into Alcatraz, and that's pretty awesome to me. Here he plays the FBI's top biochemical weapons specialist, named Stanley Goodspeed, which is a great name, by the way. Cage's character here is meant to be this plain guy, kind of an average Joe. He pretty much even says so in the movie.
Listen, I'm just a biochemist. And most of the time I work in a glass jar and lead a very uneventful life. I drive a Volvo, beige one.
But his introduction to the movie is him firing a toy gun at a Rube Goldberg machine. He spends $600 on a Beatles record. He plays guitar in nothing but a purple Speedo. I mean, you don't see it, but I can only assume that he's wearing a purple Speedo in this scene because of this quote from Michael Bay. One day I showed up on set and Cage came out for a scene in his apartment dressed in a purple Speedo. You don't want to wear the wardrobe because you want to show off your muscles? Okay, let's get it all out in the beginning of the movie. So I guess those eccentricities come from Nicolas Cage and not from the script. I probably could have guessed that. But that does kind of lead to my problem in that the way Nicolas Cage is playing it does clash from how the character is meant to appear. He just doesn't really seem like a biochemist that's an average Joe. I mean, what does that seem like, I guess? But there's just something about the way Nicolas Cage plays it and the way the character's written that really makes me suspend my disbelief towards the start of the movie.
What do you know about VX gas?
Liquid, failed pesticide, discovered by mistake in 1952. Actually, it's kind of like champagne that way. The Franciscan monks thought they were making white wine. Somehow the bottle carbonated, voila, champagne, and then the whole
gas.
And you know I love Nicolas Cage. I never say that he's miscast. I wouldn't think that he was miscast if he was playing Mother Teresa. But I can't help but wonder why they didn't get Jeff Goldblum to play the part. I mean, come on, that seems like a no-brainer. But now that I think about it, there's so many times where you see like an article on BuzzFeed where it's like, did you know that Nicolas Cage almost played Neo in The Matrix or Aragorn in Lord of the Rings? And I always go, that probably would have been a mess, but man, I wish I lived in a timeline where that version of the movie existed. And well, even if it doesn't fully work, I am glad that we live in the timeline when Nicolas Cage got to play a biochemist in a Michael Bay movie. And he also has some fantastic moments.
How, in the name of Zeus's butthole, did you get out of your cell?
I mean, as much as I love Goldblum, he can't do that. And both times I've watched this movie, I've only really had an issue with the way the character comes across in the first half of the movie. Once you get into the Alcatraz stuff, I think the character really starts to work. And I do enjoy his performance as a whole. I do really like his whole arc about stepping up to the situation, and he has some great moments reacting to the action. I also have to talk about the Rocket Man scene.
Let's talk music. Do you like the Elton John song Rocket Man?
I don't like soft ass shit.
Oh, you Well, I only bring it up because, it's you. You're the Rocket Man.
That will never not be hilarious to me. I think the main reason that makes me laugh so much is it's probably the clunkiest way that joke could have been formed. Do you like the Elton John song, Rocket Man? I mean, I'm only asking because it's you. You're the Rocket Man. Maybe if he said, hey, if you were an Elton John song, what would it be? Man, I don't listen to that soft-ass shit. Wrong. The answer is the Rocket Man. I mean, that's dumb as hell too, but maybe it would make more sense. But you know what? That scene is perfect as it is. I wouldn't change a thing. I also love Nicolas Cage's interactions with Sean Connery in this movie. Their odd couple banter is one of the highlights for sure. They play off each other so well and their chemistry is really fun to watch.
Is that normal?
What, the feet thing?
Yeah, the feet thing.
Yeah, that happens.
I'm having kind of a hard time concentrating. Can you do something about it?
Like what? Kill him again?
Sean Connery plays a convicted SAS operative. He's recruited for the mission because he's the only man that ever escaped from Alcatraz. Recruiting a prisoner on an FBI mission to take down a terrorist sounds like some strange logic. But you've also got to remember that Michael Bay's next movie was about recruiting a bunch of oil rig drillers for a space mission. So in comparison to that, this movie makes a lot of sense. And Sean Connery is fantastic in this. He's my favorite part of the film. He's hilarious and he's the epitome of cool.
You enjoying this?
Well, it's certainly more enjoyable than my average day. Reading philosophy, avoiding gang rape in the washrooms. Though it's less of a problem these days. Maybe I'm losing my sex appeal.
Wow, he just made me laugh at a rape joke in a Michael Bay movie. There's a popular theory that floats around online that Sean Connery in this movie is actually James Bond. It's a fun little piece of headcanon, I guess. I mean, Sean Connery is playing a retired ex-MI6 agent. I get why people say that. Also, does that make Nicolas Cage a Bond girl? Because, yeah, I'm down with that. At the very least, this movie does seem somewhat inspired by James Bond. And on the subject of inspiration, you could tell that the Metal Gear Solid games borrowed a lot from The Rock. The villain holding people hostage on an island. The hero arrives in by going underwater. I mean, Snake's design in MGS4 kind of looks like Sean Connery in this movie. But what brings this full circle is that the most recent James Bond movie, No Time to Die, has a plot point that seems directly taken straight from the Metal Gear Solid games. I'm not gonna ruin it, but if you know, you know. But also, the third act in No Time to Die also straight up seems taken from The Rock. It's very similar. The villain wants to unleash a poison gas and he's holed up on an island. And there's more similarities too that I won't go into. So if I've got this straight, James Bond inspired The Rock, which inspired Metal Gear Solid, which was also kinda inspired by James Bond. And now we got James Bond being inspired by The Rock and Metal Gear Solid. Or maybe it's all a coincidence and I'm full of shit, but that's kind of fun to think about. I talked about him very briefly earlier, but Ed Harris in the movie is quite possibly the most sympathetic villain I've ever seen in a movie. 83 of his men were all killed in action, and they weren't given a military burial, no medals, and no compensation to the family. He does end up demanding $100 million from the government and threatens to unleash a toxic gas on San Francisco. But I've got to say, it is a noble cause. He doesn't want to take over the world or negotiate the release of a terrorist. His sole motivation is for the family of dead soldiers to get money. And that's something I think you can get behind. He also has a dead wife, in case you don't already feel sorry for him. And a big reason why this character works so well is Ed Harris plays it with a lot of emotion and conviction. I like that his motives stay consistent throughout the movie too. I don't want to ruin it too much in case you haven't seen it, but you almost expect him to snap and go crazy towards the end. But it just doesn't happen. The whole movie he just seems remorseful even when his subordinates kill somebody. And I really like that choice for a villain. I also really like the debate that Ed Harris and Sean Connery have about his whole motivation.
The Tree of Liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Thomas Jefferson.
Patriotism is the virtue of the vicious, according to Oscar Wilde.
Who would have thought there'd be a line critiquing patriotism in a Michael Bay movie? It's surprisingly nuanced stuff, and that's why I think maybe Aaron Sorkin had his hand in it. But yeah, it's handled really well, and I think it elevates what could have been a generic villain. So overall, this movie, for want of a better phrase, rocks. You know, I like Bad Boys 2 and The Island, but this is Michael Bay's best movie by far. Sure, it has its issues, it's a little too long, and I think the pacing isn't great in the first act. But man, once it gets going, it's a hell of a lot of fun. There's some great set pieces, slick filmmaking, and quotable one-liners. But the big reason I think this movie works so well is that trio of Connery as the ex-convict James Bond, the surprisingly likable villain Ed Harris, and as much as I nitpick Nick Cage's characterization, he's still a blast in the film. To me, it's their characters and their performances that make this movie truly memorable. And it's just a good, fun, dumb 90s action romp. But as awesome as this movie is, it is not my favorite of the Cage Holy Trinity. That honor is bestowed to the next movie that Nicolas Cage did, Con Air. So until next time, guys, thanks for watching.